Welcome back to Beyond the Model. I'm Ian Martin, VDC practitioner and reality capture expert with over 20 years in BIM and reality capture for AEC and EPC projects. Today we're digging into something I get asked about constantly. Scan-to-BIM workflows failing in the field, what goes wrong, why it goes wrong, and what you actually do about it. My guest today has been in the trenches of this for years. BIM coordination, scan-to-BIM production, occupied facility work, the kind of projects where bad data isn't a recoverable situation. Welcome to the show. Yeah, and I think there's almost like a professional embarrassment thing around this. Nobody wants to say our scan program has been a mess, but everybody's dealing with it. And the silence is what keeps bad practices alive. And I want to address that directly. The purpose of this conversation isn't to point fingers, it's to actually be honest about where these workflows fall apart so people can fix them before they lose time, money, or credibility on a project. Let's start at the beginning. What's your background and how did you get into this space?
I've been doing BIM coordination for about 7 years. Started on the contractor side doing MEP clash detection and structural coordination. Pretty standard stuff, get the models, run them in Navisworks, document the clashes, run the coordination meetings. I was doing that for the first few years and got pretty comfortable with it. Then, about 4 years ago, I moved into a role that was mostly scan-to-BIM work. We were doing large renovation projects, occupied hospitals, older buildings
So that's a
where the
massive
existing
jump.
drawings were basically
How did you
useless.
handle the transition
Stuff
from
built in
working
the
with
60s
brand
and
new
70s,
models to
where nothing
working with
matched what
real
was on
world
paper.
data? Because that
That's when I
seems
really
like the
started
jump
learning what
that catches a
scan-to-BIM
lot of
actually
people
involves.
off guard.
Night and day. In new construction, you're working with clean data, clean models. Everything is authored with intent. In scan-to-BIM, you're interpreting. The point cloud doesn't tell you what a thing is. It shows you a shape, and you have to decide, is that a beam or a duct?
That's the core issue right
Is that
there.
wall structural
Walk me
or just a
through
partition?
what happened on one of those
And the
early
cloud
projects.
doesn't care about your
What
LOD
was your
requirements.
actual breakdown moment?
It gives you everything all at once, and you have to filter it. So one of the first big projects I worked on after making the switch was a hospital renovation. We had about 300,000 square feet of existing mechanical
So
space
what happened with the
that needed to be
scan?
modeled from scan data. The scope said LOD 200, which at the time I thought was pretty clear. Turns out it wasn't. The scan crew went out and did a thorough job. Good coverage, tight registration. But they captured the space, like they were doing a general survey. They didn't focus on the areas the modeling team actually needed. So we had beautiful scans of corridors and lobbies, but spotty coverage in the mechanical rooms, where all the real work was happening. Some of the risers were only partially captured because the scanner couldn't get a clean line of sight. And here's the thing that really got me. Nobody asked whether the coverage was acceptable before
Oh
they
man,
left
that's
site.
got to be frustrating.
They ran their
Were you
checklist,
involved in the
said
scan
done,
or just the
packed up,
modeling?
and left. We didn't find out until we started modeling and realized we had gaps in exactly the areas that mattered most.
There's a lesson in there about field capture
Just the
SOPs. If your
wasn't
scan
involved in the
crew
scan
doesn't
planning at
understand
all,
what the modeling
and that
team
turned out to be a
needs,
huge
you're
part
going
of
to
the
end
problem.
up with data
I
that
didn't even
looks
know the
complete
scan was
but
happening
isn't.
until they were done.
One of the things I always push for is a pre-scan coordination meeting where the modeling lead and the scan crew sit down together and go through the scope. What are we modeling? Where are the critical areas? What's the minimum data coverage? You don't leave that to chance.
Yeah, we figured that out the hard way. What happened with the deliverable was honestly the worst part. We delivered the model on time, but it had gaps. Things we had to mark as approximate or unverified because the data just wasn't there. The project manager on the client side flagged it immediately and asked why we were delivering an incomplete model when the scope said full mechanical LOD 200. And from their perspective,
Right. You
they were
can't
right.
manufacture data.
The scope
And how
said
did the client
LOD
react to that
200
explanation?
mechanical. We delivered something that had holes in it. But from our side, we couldn't model what we couldn't see. Not great. It turned into a scope dispute. We ended up doing a rescan of the mechanical rooms at our own cost and remodeling those sections. It added about 3 weeks to the schedule and wiped out the margin on the project.
That
And the worst
is
part
one of the
was,
most
it was
common and
completely
most
avoidable.
expensive
If
scan-to-BIM
we'd had the modeling
failures.
team review
And it
the
almost
scan
always
plan
comes
before
from the
anyone went
same
to
root
site,
cause,
we would have
which
caught
is that the
coverage
scan
gaps
crew
before
treated
they
the
became a
job like a
problem.
documentation exercise instead of a modeling exercise. They're capturing the space, not the model inputs. And there's a huge difference. But let me back up because there's something you said earlier that I want to push on. LOD 200. That's become such a catch-all term. Talk to me about what that actually means in the context of existing conditions.
Right? So that's a big one. An LOD 200 model of existing conditions in a renovation project is not the same thing as an LOD 200 model in a new build. In existing conditions, LOD 200 means approximated geometry from field data.
100%.
In a
And I
new
think
build,
this
it
is where a
means
lot of
preliminary
scan-to-BIM providers
design.
get themselves into
The
trouble.
number
The
is the
client
same,
says
but the meaning
LOD
is completely
200 and the
different.
provider either
It's like they're
overmodels or
speaking the same
undermodels
language but using
because they're
different
using
dialects.
new construction definitions instead of existing conditions definitions. You need to define LOD explicitly in the contract. What does LOD 200 mean for this project? Show examples, show exclusions. If you skip that step, you're setting yourself up for scope disputes later. That's almost as common as the scan coverage issue.
Oh man, absolutely.
One
And it's crazy
sentence.
because the
Huh,
fix
exactly.
is so simple.
That's not a
Just
definition,
write it
that's a
down.
footnote.
Define
Now
it
let's
clearly.
shift gears a bit. We've
But so
talked
many
about
contracts
field
don't have it.
capture and scope
I've seen
definition.
templates
Let's
where
talk about
LOD is mentioned
registration.
once in a sentence.
That's another area where I see things go sideways consistently. What's your experience been with scan registration issues and how they affect the downstream model?
Most of my experience has been with cloud-to-cloud registration, usually in Recap or sometimes in the Trimble software. And when it works great. But I've had situations where the registration report says everything is within tolerance, but the actual alignment is off. The software is telling
That's
you it's
exactly
fine.
right. And your
But
gut
when you
is
overlay
usually
the
right.
data with known
Explain
control
that for people
points,
who might not
there's
be
a
familiar.
drift.
What do you
It's this
mean by
weird
accumulated
situation where
drift?
the math says pass, but your gut says something's wrong. So when you register scan to scan across a large area, each registration introduces a small error. Individually, those errors are within tolerance, but they accumulate. So by the time you get to the far end of a building, you might be off by 2 or 3 inches, even though every individual registration passed. The software doesn't flag it
I've seen
because
that.
each step is within spec.
I worked on a healthcare
But the
project
total
where the scan
accumulated error is
registration
not.
looked perfect in
It's like a
recap.
GPS
Clean, no
going
errors.
off by a foot at each
But
step
when we
of a
brought
journey.
it into Revit
And
and
suddenly
started
you're 3
modeling,
blocks from where
we
you think you are.
realized that the point cloud in one wing of the building was shifted about 4 inches from the actual position, just enough to throw off every single wall and penetration in that area. We caught it early, but if we hadn't, the entire mechanical coordination would have been based on shifted geometry, which would have been a disaster. How do you prevent that? What's the actual workflow?
You need external control, ground control points, survey monuments, something independent from the scan data itself. You register locally, and then you tie the whole thing to control. That way, even if there's some drift in the cloud-to-cloud registration, the control points bring it back into alignment. And if the control check shows a problem, you know exactly where in the chain the drift started. Without that, you're just hoping it holds together.
That's critical. And you know what I see a lot of firms do? They trust the software too much. Recap says the registration passed, so they move on. But they never verified it against anything external. No control points, no survey tie-ins. And then 6 weeks later, the model doesn't align with field conditions and everyone's pointing fingers. It's classic technology over trust. Right. So now let's move to Revit. Once the point cloud is registered and linked, what are the most common Revit side issues you see in scan-to-BIM work?
3 big ones. First is shared coordinates. If the point cloud and the Revit model aren't using the same coordinate system, nothing lines up, and you're going to waste a huge amount of time troubleshooting something that should have been set up correctly on day one. Second is LOD scope creep. The modeler starts adding detail that wasn't in the scope because they can see it in the cloud and they think they should include it. Before you know it, you've doubled the modeling time and blown the budget. Third is version control. When you're working with multiple point cloud files, multiple Revit links, and a model that's being updated by several people, things get messy fast if you don't have a system.
The shared coordinate issue is massive. I've seen teams lose days trying to troubleshoot why their model doesn't align with the point cloud, and it's because somebody set up the survey point wrong or linked the point cloud using the wrong origin method. It's a 5-minute mistake that costs days to fix, and it often doesn't get caught until the model is well underway.
Yeah, there's a shared coordinate setup guide I use that specifies exactly how to link the point cloud into Revit, what the survey point should be, how to set project base point versus survey point, and how to verify the alignment before any modeling starts. It's a 1-page document, but it saves hours of troubleshooting on every single project. Without it, every project is a coin flip on whether the alignment is going to work. Oh man, it's the killer. The LOD scope creep on scan-to-BIM is one of the biggest margin killers I've seen in this business. And it's so insidious because it never happens all at once. It's death by 1,000 cuts. You model the main systems, then they ask you to add the secondary systems. Then, oh, can you just add the fittings? Can you add the hangers? Can you add the electrical conduit? Before you know it, you've spent 100 hours more than you budgeted.
It's always incremental. Can you just model that too is the most dangerous sentence in this business because it sounds so small and so reasonable. It's so polite. It doesn't sound like a scope change. It sounds like a favor.
While you're at it, right? That phrase has cost me money. I hear those 3 words and now I'm doing extra work.
And it's almost always said with completely good intentions. The client isn't trying to steal work from you. They just don't understand that each additional element has its own check, its own QA, its own downstream coordination requirement. It's not just 10 more minutes of modeling. What goes into a scope document that actually prevents this?
A good scope document for scan-to-BIM has at minimum the LOD definition with examples, a list of what is being modeled by system, a list of what is explicitly excluded, the deliverable format and version, the number of revisions included, and a section on assumptions and limitations. That last part is critical. If you're assuming the client will provide access to all areas, say so. If you're assuming the point cloud data will be within a certain tolerance, say so. If you're assuming you're not going to model anything that requires destructive investigation, write that down. Anything you're assuming should be written down so there's no ambiguity later. Yeah, that's the creep that nobody talks about. It's not just geometry. It's all the ancillary work that comes with it. And it happens because the modeler is good at their job and wants to be helpful. So when someone asks a question, they answer it thoroughly instead of saying, "That's outside the scope." I've totally done that. Spent hours making equipment schedules that should have been someone else's job.
Right? Version control is another one people mess up constantly. You've got the raw scan data, the registered point cloud, the recap project, the Revit model, linked files, coordination models. And if any of those get out of sync, you're in trouble. I've seen projects where someone was modeling from an outdated point cloud because the file got overwritten and nobody noticed for 2 weeks.
Oh man, 2 weeks of modeling on the wrong data, folder structure, naming conventions, and a change log. Every time a file is updated, it gets logged. Who changed it, what changed, when. We use a shared folder with a naming convention that includes the date and version number. It's not fancy, but it works. And everyone on the team knows exactly where to find the current version of any file. The key is consistency. It doesn't matter what system you use, as long as everyone uses the same one.
And you know what happens when you don't have that? The new person comes in, asks where the current scan file is. Nobody knows for sure. And then that person leaves and the next project comes in and you spend 3 hours trying to get the scan files to link and you have no idea why they won't. Something that should take 5 minutes takes half a day and nobody knows why. It's so avoidable.
Yeah, you start building tribal knowledge instead of documented systems. And then all that knowledge walks out the door. Which brings me to something I really wanted to talk about, which is the lack of training when people come into this role. There's no formal scan-to-BIM curriculum. I learned everything by failing and then fixing. And we have junior staff coming in now, and I'm watching them repeat the exact same mistakes I made 4 years ago.
Talk about that. What does training look like for junior staff coming into scan-to-BIM?
Right now, it's mostly just shadowing and learning by doing. They come in, we throw them at a project. They make mistakes, we correct them, they learn. But it's inefficient, and it's really expensive because those mistakes happen on billable projects. I've been trying to build out an internal training program, but even that is just me documenting what I've learned. There's no industry standard, no curriculum. Every firm is basically reinventing the wheel.
Let's talk about something else I want to dig into, which is the actual scanning methodology. I know you've worked with different types of capture. You mentioned point cloud capture, but there are other methods. Let's talk about terrestrial scanning versus drone capture and photogrammetry. When do you use which?
That's a good question because it's not always obvious to people. Terrestrial laser scanning is still the gold standard for precision. You get really dense point clouds with excellent accuracy. That's what you want for mechanical rooms, utility spaces, anything where you need to coordinate tightly. But it's slow. You set up the scanner in a spot, let it run for 5 to 10 minutes, move to the next spot, do it again. For a large building, that can take days.
Right? And you need scanner stations in the right positions to get coverage.
Photogrammetry and drone capture are faster. You fly a drone, take hundreds of photos, run them through photogrammetry software, and you get a point cloud. It's not as dense, but it's fast, and it's good for exteriors and open areas. I've used DJI drones on several projects now, and for capturing roofs, facades, courtyards, it's perfect. You get data in an afternoon that would take terrestrial scanning a day or two.
So how do you decide which to use on a project?
Scope matters. Are you modeling interiors, exteriors, or both? Interior mechanical spaces, terrestrial all day. Facades and roofs, drone and photogrammetry. Large open areas like parking structures or courtyards, drone is faster. But here's the thing, on most medium to large projects, you end up using both. Terrestrial for the detailed interior work, drone for the exterior and structural envelope. The key is knowing which method gives you the data you actually need for modeling, not just the most data.
Let's talk about QA/QC, because even when everything else goes right, the deliverable can still fail if the quality check process isn't built into the workflow. That's something I see a lot of firms get wrong.
The problem with QA at the end is you've already spent all the hours. The model is built. And now you're checking it with fresh eyes and finding things that should have been caught weeks ago. By that point, your options are fix it and eat the cost, or ship it and hope nobody notices. Neither one is a good business decision.
That model quality thing is huge. I always tell my teams if QA/QC is happening at the end, it's already too late. You've already made all the decisions, you've already placed all the elements. If you find a systemic error at the end, you're either reworking the whole thing or shipping something you know has problems. Neither option is good. What does your ideal QA/QC workflow look like?
Stage gates. We break the project into phases. After the initial setup, survey point, linked cloud, we check the alignment. After the first area is modeled, maybe 10% of the scope, we do a full review. Is the LOD correct? Are we matching the scope document? Is the modeling style consistent? If something is off, we catch it at 10%, not at 90%. Then, we check again at 50% and again at final. Each check has a specific list of items we're looking for. It's not just, does this look right? It's, does this meet the documented standard?
I love the stage gate approach. It's the only way to catch things early when they're still cheap to fix. And it also creates documentation. If a question comes up 6 months later about why something was modeled a certain way, you have the checkpoint record that shows the decision was made at stage 2 and approved by the lead. That kind of traceability is critical, especially on healthcare and infrastructure projects.
And then that documentation becomes your standard for the next project. You build on it. Whereas if QA happens at the end, there's nothing to build on. The next project starts from scratch.
What tools are you using for QA/QC? Is it all manual or do you have any automation built in?
We use a mix. Navisworks for clash detection and visual checks. Verity for automated point cloud to model comparison, which is incredibly powerful for catching drift or missed elements. Dynamo for some automated checks like verifying that all elements have the required parameters filled in. And then, good old-fashioned section box walkthroughs in Revit, which honestly catch more problems than any automated tool. There's no substitute for a human looking at the model in context and asking, does this make sense?
That's the honest answer. Automation is useful for catching the obvious stuff, the duplicate elements, the missing parameters, the clashes. But the judgment calls, the interpretation, the does this actually represent what's on site question, that's still human. Now I want to talk about something that's becoming more and more part of the scan-to-BIM workflow, which is collaboration platforms. Specifically, Autodesk Construction Cloud. How does ACC fit into the picture for you? Right. So no more, wait, do you have the latest version of the model?
There is no latest version in that sense. There's one model, it's an ACC, and everyone sees the same thing. And the collaboration features are helpful too. You can leave comments on specific parts of the model, flag issues, tag people. For scan-to-BIM, where coordination between scan processing and modeling teams is so important, having that all centralized is huge.
Okay, now let me ask you about something that I've encountered, and I'm curious if you have too, which is what's the most ridiculous or funniest field scanning mishap you've ever seen? Because I feel like there are stories there.
Okay, yes. So we did a scan on an occupied office building where the building was still in use while we were scanning. And between the first and second scanner station, a facility manager moved about 15 pieces of furniture around. So we have a scan that shows the furniture in position A, and then 5 minutes later, another scan shows it in position B. And for some reason, nobody mentioned this while we were processing the data. So we spent like 3 hours trying to figure out why the geometry didn't align in that area, thinking it was a registration error. Turned out to be a janitor moving couches.
Oh man, that's the kind of thing nobody talks about in scan planning. You're in an occupied space and people are literally moving things while you're scanning.
We had a scanner actually get knocked over by a construction worker who didn't realize it was a $12,000 laser scanner and not some kind of decoration. Literally kicked it over. We lost a full station of data and the scanner needed repairs. The good news is the construction worker was very apologetic and the project manager bought us coffee for a week.
Huh. Well, that's some compensation. But yeah, that's the kind of risk you don't really budget for. How do you protect against that?
Honestly, you communicate with the site team. Tell them what you're doing, where the equipment is, ask them to keep an eye on it. And you never leave the scanner unattended in an active work area. It's not just about theft, it's about accidents. Construction sites are chaotic.
Right? Okay, so in your experience, what separates a good scan-to-BIM operation from a bad one? If you had to boil it down.
It's process. Hands down, the technology is there. We have incredible scanners, incredibly powerful software, amazing hardware. None of that matters if your process is broken. The firms that do this well have documented workflows, they have clear scope definitions, they have QA built into every step, and they have communication between field and office. The firms that struggle are the ones that buy the scanner, hand it to someone, and say, "Go." The tool doesn't fix a bad process. It just makes it faster. A bad process with a good tool is just a bad process that's bad faster. The first thing is being clear on what LOD the project actually needs. A lot of wasted time comes from over-modeling because nobody set a clear standard up front. Write it down. Define it with examples. The second thing is documenting every scope assumption and exclusion before work starts. Not during, not after, before. What are you modeling? What are you not modeling? What are you assuming about the data? And the third thing is putting a QA checkpoint at 10% completion instead of waiting until the end. Those 3 changes alone would prevent probably 80% of the problems I've seen over the last 4 years.
These are the structural fixes that pay dividends for every project after. It's not glamorous work, but it's the work that actually matters. And here's the thing that might not be obvious to someone just getting into this. Doing those 3 things right actually saves time on the project itself. You don't lose time up front by documenting scope. You gain it back immediately because you're not reworking things or dealing with scope disputes. And you don't lose time by checking at 10%. You save time because you catch problems when they're still small. Let's talk about what's coming next. This conversation has been focused on the problems and solutions in scan-to-BIM, but there's a broader transformation happening: reality capture, automation, AI-assisted modeling. Where do you think this is all headed?
Photogrammetry is going to play a bigger role. DJI and other drone platforms are making it easier to capture exteriors and large open spaces. AI-assisted classification is getting better, being able to identify pipes and ducts and structural elements from point cloud data automatically. That's going to speed up the initial modeling phase a lot, but I don't think it replaces the human entirely, at least not in the near term. The judgment calls, the interpretation of existing conditions, that's still a human skill.
Do you think AI will replace the modeler?
Not replace, augment. The repetitive work, tracing pipes, placing fittings, generating basic geometry, I can do that faster and more consistently than a person. But the decision of what to model, how to interpret ambiguous data, how to handle conflicts between the scan and the design intent, that's where you need someone who understands construction, not just software. The modeler of the future is more like a technical reviewer than a drafter.
I agree completely. The modeler role is going to evolve, not disappear. The people who understand the data, who can make judgment calls about intent versus geometry, they're going to be more valuable, not less. AI is going to handle the repetitive stuff, the pipe runs, the wall placements, maybe even some of the QA checks, but the decisions, the interpretations, the field knowledge, that stays human. That's the person you actually need on these projects. That's the real insight. The scanner is table stakes at this point. Everybody can get one. But the firms that have documented process, that train people right, that build QA into their workflow, those are the ones that are going to win. One more thing I'd add, if you're a firm that's just getting into scan-to-BIM, don't try to figure it all out yourself. Find someone who's already been through it. Hire a consultant, partner with a firm that has experience, bring in a VDC manager who knows the pitfalls. The tuition on learning this stuff by trial and error is way too high. The cost of getting it wrong on even one project can exceed the cost of getting help up front.
Absolutely. That's the best money a firm can spend when they're starting out. Get a coach, learn from somebody who's already been through it. I appreciate that, Ian, and I'd say to anyone listening, don't be embarrassed about where your workflow is today. Every program I've seen that's now running well went through a messy phase first. The important thing is to start documenting, start standardizing, and start checking your work early. The rest follows.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you for being so open about the real challenges. I think a lot of people listening are going to hear themselves in these stories and hopefully take away some concrete steps. Before we sign off, where can people find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I post about BIM coordination and scan-to-BIM workflow improvements pretty regularly. Always happy to connect with people who are working through these challenges.
Perfect. Thanks again for joining me on Beyond the Model. For everyone listening, if you're dealing with scan-to-BIM challenges, you're not alone. The path forward is process, documentation, and honest assessment of where your gaps are. I'm Ian Martin. See you next time.
Thanks for having me. This was a great conversation. I hope people get some real value out of it.